Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Nathalie Gontier, a PhD. She's a director of the Applied Evolutionary Epistemology Lab. She's part of the Faculty of Science on the University of Lisbon in Portugal. So she's going to be part of the virus book that I'm putting together. So I think she'll make a great addition. So Nathalie, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be back on your show. And I look forward to participating in this project.
Well, first, again, for people that don't know a bit about your background and your current research, what are you doing?
So I'm a philosopher of science. I am not a virologist. I'm a philosopher of science, and I study evolutionary theory. So I focus on the field of biology. And within that field, I focus on one aspect I focus on is reticulate evolution. So that is evolution as it occurs by means of hybridization, symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, and infective heredity. And so in that regard, I'm interested in viruses because viruses are one of the most common parasites that every life form has to cope with. And so I'm very interested in seeing how that interaction occurs in trying to help to think alongside the scientists on how these interactions can be visualized. And most of the time that is visualized in networks, for example. And so one of the things I'm interested in is helping to think along the lines of science in how we can reconceptualize this form of interaction.
Okay. Well, I always, for these interviews, I want speculation because a lot of the questions just demand it. Mm-hmm. So don't be afraid to do that. Mm-hmm. And again, if you don't know an answer, it's okay. If it's too far afield. But you're coming from a very different perspective than anyone else, and that's going to make the book a lot better. So I'm happy to talk to you.
Well, let's see about that.
Yeah. So, first question, is there any form of life or any organism that does not have a virus?
No. So the life at present is distinguished into three domains: archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes, which are multicellular organisms. And viruses infect all three of them. So viruses do not exclude any kind of life form that exists in the world today. Any
examples of viruses that prey upon a given life form that just really amazes you? That there's even viruses for that thing?
At this moment in time, I think it's very hard not to be amazed by COVID-19. I am really amazed by that virus. It is a very recent virus people are discovering, and it is really on its way up on the food chain, if so to speak, within the virus domain. This is very interesting to see how one virus can so quickly, and by making use of our species, so quickly can conquer the world and infect so many people, kill so many people. We're almost at 1 million of people who have died from COVID-19 at the moment. So that is really incredible to see in 1 year time how one virus can be so destructive and so quick and able at multiplying itself amongst one species.
Yeah, no, true. Very true. Do you think that viruses are alive, or do you think that they're contingently alive once they enter a cell?
Also, there are different theories about that, right? A lot of people say that viruses are not alive. And the main reason that they alive is that they do not have some kind of self. So any kind of organism has a unique lifespan. It has a beginning and a lifespan and an ending in time. And as far as we know, nobody comes back the same. It is mathematically speaking, if you see how individuals are made, especially eukaryotic organisms are made, it is impossible for the same organism to arise twice. Bacteria, for example, they can split, and so there is a mere division of the same individual, but a eukaryotic being, an animal, a plant, that is in many ways a unique organism. Also, insofar as plants are duplicates sometimes of their mother plant, they still have specific areas in the genome where they are unique. And so one of the things that viruses do not have is that kind of uniqueness. One of the things that viruses do is make more copies of existing material, so they make more viruses. Sometimes those viral strains mutate. Sometimes they mutate a lot, sometimes a little, but one of the things that viruses do not have is that kind of self. They also need the metabolism of living organisms to do anything, basically. Freeman Dyson, for example, he was a very famous physicist at Princeton University who recently died. He in his book On the Origin of Life, he made a distinction between hardware and software. So you can look at an organism such as a bacteria or a human being, you can see that as a hardware. And a virus you can see as a software. And so that a software needs the hardware in order to do anything of its program. And so in that regard, there is no autonomy. A virus does not have autonomy, some people say. And so some people say that because of that, it does not live. On the other hand, some people say that viruses are alive because, you know, if you look at the cycle of life, every human being might be unique, but all of us are born into existence. We have our lifespan and then we die. And so that is a repetitive cycle. And we see that viruses also have a cycle. So they have a cycle of attaching themselves to their host, penetrating, releasing their capsid, making more copies, and then destroying the cell. That is also a cycle that is part of the virus. So in that regard, there is a similarity. It's a very difficult question. I myself remain conflicted about whether or not to call viruses alive or not. But one thing is for sure, they are companions to life, because every kind of life form, archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotic organisms have viruses. They are a part of life. They are a necessary, I don't know if it's a necessary companion, but it is a companion. Some people, for example, Louis Villarreal, he says that it's a form of viral colonization, that every kind of life form is colonized by viruses. Maybe that
if you know, like almost 10% of our genome is viral DNA, and you know the placenta, from what I understand, it uses viral proteins to isolate the fetus from the mother. So yes. I don't think without viruses we would be here.
No, but then it was also never required for us to be here, and the fact that happened was a contingency, perhaps, and at that moment, perhaps there was some opportune reason for that kind of interaction. But there was no purpose of a virus, for example, to help establish the human placenta. So yeah.
If I think about a seed, let's say of a tree. Now I look at the tree. I'm looking at one right now outside the window. Mm-hmm. It's alive. No one would say it's not alive. But the seed, if it has seeds, is that alive? You know, and mm-hmm. if most of the time I'm observing seeds and I rarely ever see a tree, mm-hmm. I probably would think like, oh, you know, trees aren't alive. They're just like for a period of time, if they're in the right soil and in the right conditions, they're alive. But maybe that's how we see viruses, is that we think about and imagine like the virion stage, and we don't think about the stage where a virus is inside a cell. And maybe therefore we're saying like, oh, they're not alive because at some point, if they're not inside a cell, they can't do anything.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to call viruses alive or not, you have to have a definition of what life is, right? And so for many years, people thought that you could only have living organisms when there was oxygen. But then people discovered anaerobe bacteria that live in oxygen deprived environments and that actually get killed when they are in an oxygen-rich environment. We have always also thought that life needs water, but there are theories that say that there might be life based upon alcohol or some other kind of substance that would replace the functioning of water. Especially when people look at outer space, there's a lot of alcohol in space, and so some people are looking into how alcohol might be a substitute for water. Another thing that people are doing is actually looking for water in Mars and other planets to see whether there might be life forms. Aristotle, for example, one of the first philosophers to think almost scientifically, or what was scientific in his day and age about life. He said that there is some kind of essence to things, and I thought about it when you talked about that seed. He said that, for example, a seed has in itself already the essence to become the grown individual that it can be. So, for example, a seed that becomes a melon, for example, has in itself the property to become a melon. And that is also what makes it unique and what makes it into what it is. He said that was the whatness of the individual. This day and age, we don't think in those terms because we call it teleological. So the idea that a seed has as purpose or as function or as goal to become the grown-up fruit, a tree, a melon, whatever, is assuming that there is some kind of foresight, that there is some kind of goal-directedness. And that is also one of the big questions in science and in biology that people keep fighting over, whether there is such a thing, whether there is such a kind of teleology. So in that regard, for example, viruses, we could like ask ourselves, are they useful? Sometimes human beings or other organisms, they have some benefits from being colonized by them, but most of the time they can be quite destructive as well. So is there a goal to that? That's a very interesting question, and people debate that, but to give a straightforward answer to that is very difficult.
Yeah.
But so in order to define a virus as living or not, we need to have a definition of what life is. And at this moment, we don't have a solid definition of what life is. Most of the time, life is defined based upon metabolism and based upon some kind of autonomy.
Well, even if you think about people, some people say life begins at conception. Some people say, no, it's not till 3 months or 6 months or the baby's born. So even with our own species, we can't even agree as to what life is and when life begins. So I don't know if we'll ever have a definition that everyone will agree with. It's tough.
Yes, because there, and then especially in debates on abortion, a lot of people are pushing the definition of life between the embryo and the fetus. For example, Descartes, he was a philosopher. He said, "I think, therefore I am." That was like the definition of a conscious human being. And he said that he was because he could think himself. So that implies that you have to have an organism that has a brain, that uses that brain to think, and that thereby, by thinking, comes to the conclusion that he is. And what does that mean to be then? Like to have this kind of self-awareness and this consciousness. And so one of the things that people have been doing is they have tried to look for self-consciousness in other animals. And so one of the things that people do with primates, for example, is the mirror test. If you put a chimpanzee in front of a mirror and you color the cheek of a chimpanzee, he will look inside the mirror and he will touch his own face. He will not touch the mirror. He knows that he is looking at himself. If you put a dog in front of the mirror, the dog will bark at his image, thinking that it is a different kind of dog and that he needs to defend his territory. So there is no self-awareness in that regard. But that by itself is already the idea that you have to know how you look like, that you have to have some kind of concept of what a mirror is, or some kind of like self-reflection. While some people say this is not a good way to define self-consciousness. A moth, for example, has no self-consciousness because it flies to the light and it will burn its wings. So it has no sense of a boundary whatsoever. But a lot of animals will go away from fire at this moment in time. There are a lot of fires again in America.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
And
well, what if we turn the argument around? You and I and all people are composed of trillions of cells, trillions of bacteria and viruses and all that. And we're not aware of any of them. I feel like one person. So I have no consciousness, no awareness of 99% of me. Yes. So maybe, I'm kind of stupid in that regard. So it's I guess there's two ways to look at it.
That is also a question that is being asked, is that are the viruses that are inside of us as parts in our DNA, remnants of old viruses, or the viruses that are perhaps somehow on our skin, or the bacteria, are they part of us? We don't feel them. We didn't know that they were there for many billions of years. Most animals, viruses, as we said, viruses are in all domains of life, and as so far as we know, we are the only ones that somehow are conscious of them, and we only discovered that about a century ago, that there were these kinds of infectious agents, and most of the time, most animals, they don't know that, plants, they don't know that, or we don't know whether they somehow like realize that they have a disease or something like that. But are they part of you? Some people say that you become a plus one. So the idea that there is a unique individual and that individual is singular is an idea that is outdated, that is cast in old kinds of anthropological jargon, philosophical jargon, that is no longer to the point. And so we should think about ourselves as holobionts. So we are biological individuals, but we are basically a group. We have our own conscious self, but we can only function because we have commensal relationships with bacteria in our gut. If we wouldn't have that, we would be sick. We have relationships with viruses, etc. So in that regard, this viriome and this microbiome forms a part of us and makes us what we are. And so in that regard, you are not only an individual, you are a group, and you are even by yourself a full ecosystem. You are in many ways a habitable zone of life. Many viruses if you look at our DNA, we have a lot of parts of the DNA that are remnants of old viruses. And so somehow you can look at that as genes that have found shelter in our DNA. The microbiome that helps us to digest our food lives in an oxygen low environment in our gut, while the world outside is full of oxygen, so they would die. So that is like a commensal relationship that we have built that enables all of us to survive, and that enables us to become an ecological system by ourselves. We are a biosystem. So in philosophy, sometimes people say that one person is a library because he or she has read so many books, but one person is also a landscape. It is a world in itself.
So why do you think that when someone gets infected by a virus, there's a latency period? Why does it take a while? Is it just the exponential replication of virus and quote unquote enough cells are affected? Or do you think there's some signaling or coordination or quorum sensing that goes on where the virus is communicating using cellular machinery and saying, all right, we're ready, let's attack?
So there was a team in Israel, in the Weizmann Institute around Rotem Sorek, that found that there indeed is some kind of quorum sensing. So viral particles can apparently iterate with one another and inform whether or not it is opportune to become start the lytic phase or not. So they can decide. Well, it's a form of biochemical communication, but they can communicate at the molecular level with each other about whether or not to attack their bacterial host. And so that raises a lot of questions, because there you have this entity. You cannot really call it an organism because it doesn't have that metabolism. It has to have the metabolism of others. And of living organisms, but there you have these groups of viruses that apparently are able to somehow at a molecular level, so a very well established biochemical level, communicate whether or not to attack a host, whether or not to stay dormant. And people are investigating now whether they even have a sense of how many viruses there are. So it appears that much of that has to do with opportunity. Another thing is also that some viruses, you have those names. You have the swine flu virus, and some viruses have like these specific names because they are associated with specific animals, and it is then all of a sudden that they are you can say in a way that they are stuck to those animals. So one of the reasons that sometimes it might not be opportune to go to the virulent phase is that they might not have opportunity to do so. But like what happened with the COVID virus, for example, so we know that there are several variants of these coronaviruses. And so a group of these viruses is found in camels, a group of these viruses is found in the musk palm civet cat. And so what we know is that all of a sudden, we know that they all originated from bats, that they somehow jumped from bats to these other organisms, and then somehow they jumped from there to human beings. And so what we see there is that there was opportunity. So most of the time, these viruses are part of one species, and they are specifically adapted to that species. And then most of the time, they sort of make harmless infections in those hosts. But then when they jump, they take on they start to spread very rapidly and very fiercely, and they can like the COVID now attack millions of organisms of one species. So sometimes I think it's opportunity that they are just unable, that they have to evolve and mutate randomly to be able to jump from one species to another. Hello?
Yeah, well, why do you think viruses will change behavior? Some are, pathogenic and they just get inside and multiply and blow cells open and kill them. Other ones will be latent inside them or lysogenic, for the organism's whole life sometimes. And then sometimes they'll be like that for a period of time. And, when the organism, let's say, is stressed, they'll come out and now become lytic. And some even endogenize into DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Why are there these three behaviors of viruses, and what governs them and when they change?
I think a lot of it also might have to do with interaction. So sometimes the virus can be made harmless by the host. Sometimes the virus is able to hide from the host, and so it is not detected by the host immune system. Sometimes the virus loses its own tricks, so to speak. Sometimes it loses parts of its software, so to say, and it becomes unable to attack or to leave, so to say. So and sometimes it is very able to spread, and then we see that it can very quickly make an enormous amount of copies and release that into the environment and provide more infections. And then through those infections, the mutation rate of the virus also increases. So the more copies that are made, the more chance there is for error. The more chance there is for error, the more evolution there is of that virus, the more growth there is of that virus. But there again, these are phenomena that we see, but we use anthropomorphic jargon to talk about that. And then the question is there some kind of consciousness, like for example with this form of quorum sensing that we see? Apparently some viruses, like, and just like the common flu, can keep track of how many cells it is infecting. So is there a plan? It is a very interesting question, but I have no definite answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, a lot of these questions will be difficult like that. I've also noticed that viruses appear to be matched in how they infect, what tissues and cells they infect, and then how they propagate. So if I'm bitten by a dog with rabies, it's going to make me want to bite other people, salivate and spread it by biting.
Yeah.
You know, why is AIDS not spread by coughing and sneezing? Why sexual transmission, and why is influenza, acquired by respiratory droplets and then transmitted by respiratory droplets? It seems like there's a matching between the cells infected and then the mechanism of transfer to another host.
Yeah, I don't know.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know I don't know if we can think about that, like in those kinds of terms. So I think there is such a thing as opportunity in nature. So for example, we have us mammals, for example, we have a breathing apparatus. And so we know that mammals have respiratory diseases. And that is, I think, an opportunity. So we have these cavities in our body, and they can be penetrated, and they can provide a place for shelter where bacteria, for example, can grow, or or viruses, like we have airways, so we can breathe in viral particles such as the flu. And then we also see that there are specific adaptations and mutations in these viruses that enable them to penetrate or to communicate somehow biochemically with our cells. So some viruses know how to penetrate our cells. They know how to enter our cells. They know how to put themselves inside of our genome. They know how to make our genome ignore its own genes in favor of the viral genes, and then replicate itself and eventually lead to the destruction of the cell. So they can somehow do that. But there, what we see is a form of coevolution. And that I think that is based on opportunity. And so we see that they make use of our sexual organs, anything that makes like a kind of fluid exchange. So sexual organs, breathing, any kind of mucus, sneezing, wherever there is some kind of fluid that is exchanged, it is being used of that. People, the viruses make use of that, and people can be infected like that. Also, just like eating, food can be one of the biggest sources of infections. So that is also where we can find bacteria that can infect us, or also like viral particles, for example. They are sometimes transmitted through that. Also through vectors like mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, for example, are one of the biggest insect species that are a transportation system, so to speak, between the animals that they sting and the bacteria and the viruses that they carry. So viruses that are transmitted by mosquitoes are the dengue virus and the Zika virus and the West Nile virus. There are so many different viruses that are being transmitted by mosquitoes, and what happens there is, again, it's opportunity. So I don't know if we can really say that there is a virus that, for example, through rabies says and it programs to bite, and if you have rabies, you want to bite. It's true, like dogs that have been infected with rabies, they will go wild and bite other ones. But that is a very interesting question. Like, is a bite reflex somehow induced by an infection by rabies? Is there some kind of chemical road towards that? So far as I know, I don't think that the gene or a kind of chemical pathway has been discovered that says that it is, but it is something. Yeah, why does that happen? A person that has been infected with the flu will sneeze more Is that genetically determined? Is that biochemically determined? Or is that just the airways that are infected that make you sneeze?
Mm. Yeah, I don't know. It just seems to be like, not in every case, but there's a lot of matching. So,
Yeah,
I just wonder.
that is a form of coevolution. So it's
I see. I don't know how it's possible, but I see in all of this agency, and again, this matching in going from lytic to lysogenic to, and back and forth from latent to, pathogenic, etc. But, again, that's just my perception. But that's why I ask is what do you think all this behavior is coming from?
It all depends on how we define agency. And for example, James Shapiro from Chicago University, he says, and I agree with most of what he says. I think he's a genius scholar. He says that you can find agency at a genetic level in mobile genetic elements, in viruses and genes and plasmids. He says, like, from as soon as you have those elements, you can say that there is agency, because there is some kind of behavior, there is some kind of functional behavior, and in a way, like they have they know what to do and what not to do, and there is some kind of self-preservation, etc. And I hear him and I agree, but they're like, in philosophy, that and their philosophy is completely behind. There is no way at this moment in time to define that kind of agency in the way that we have been doing that, because agency has been defined by a kind of self, and that self has been defined by a kind of consciousness and by a kind of self-identification and self-defense, etc. And so we are that's also a question, like, is we are talking here about genes and about mobile elements and about bacteria and viruses, and they don't even have a brain. They don't even have some kind of neurological system that enables them to have any kind of self-awareness. So what we need to do then, if we want to talk about cognition at that level and thinking about that and thinking in at that level, we have to redefine it. So we have to take away any kind of consciousness, any kind of neurological basis of cognition. And then there are a lot of philosophers that would say, well, if you take away the neurological part of cognition, then there is no cognition at all. Then you have to call it something else.
Mm.
But the reason why, for example, somebody like James Shapiro says that it is cognition is because he sees that link. He says, like, is there, he asks the question, and it is a very important question, a very difficult question. Is there a difference between thinking neurologically and behaving molecularly and genetically?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. Yeah. I guess another question I had for now is, if I get infected with a virus and I just label myself patient number 1, and then I give it to you and you're number 2, and then you give it to someone and they're number 3, and so on. By the time the virus gets to like number 20, it's passaged through 20 people. Do you think it's going to become more virulent, less virulent, more commensal, maybe even try to endogenize? Do you think viruses have a goal that they're going towards? Are they evolving towards becoming, again, more commensal, or do you think they're going somewhere in some direction?
I think these are very difficult questions to ask, and I also wonder about the formulation of that, because again, is there a goal? Is there some kind of conscious decision that is being made towards that? I don't know, biochemically, we see that there is some kind of quorum sensing that they somehow, through some kind of peptides, are able to say that they are there, that they are somehow signaling, like, you're not alone here, like I am here too, infecting this organism. Like somehow they have an idea that others are there, whether or not it's opportune to stay dormant or not to stay dormant and to go to the lytic phase. But is that going somewhere? It's not only a virus. Like an infection is something that might be induced by a virus. It might be induced by a virus, but there's also a host. So first of all, when a virus penetrates an organism, there is also the opportunity that he had, but there is also the organism that either was somehow enabling that or unable to fence it off? That's already the first question. When an organism is infected by a virus, is that because it is unable to fence it off, or is it because it allows it to enter? These are the terminology here is difficult, like a lot of people object to it and they just look at a biochemical level, like is there like some kind of lock and key system? And there we see that there is often a coevolution. So a virus is often able to enter, and an organism is often able to fence it off, sometimes by previous viruses. So sometimes we know that a virus is one kind of virus might not be able to infect some kind of organism because that organism has been able to fence off that virus because it was infected by another virus. So there it is the viruses that are fighting with each other in a way, but sometimes we know that we have organisms have been able to benefit from some viral infections. Or they have been able to eventually, again, anthropomorphically speaking, to somehow get along with each other. So what we see is that a lot of viruses are in parts of the DNA which used to be called junk DNA. So the idea that was there that these genes are not used, but now we know that that junk DNA has a lot of genes that are not just junk, that are actually being used, and sometimes used for good, sometimes used for bad. So we know that there are viruses that cause cancer. We also know that there are viruses that help, for example, fence off other viruses or give you properties that you would not have had without the virus. So
what about virus-like behavior? Viruses seem to use tools. They seem to be used as tools. Like viruses will take genetic material from their hosts. They'll use cellular machinery for their purposes. But at the same time, bacteria have co-opted spike proteins from viruses and express them themselves. And, part of bacterial immunity is to take viral DNA and use it themselves. And, it seems like they're tools, but they're also, agents for their own propagation as well. It's weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is also a trait that they share with a lot of living organisms. Like a lot of living organisms, even bacteria use tools. It's not just viruses. Like there are studies that demonstrate that sometimes particles are used as weapons against other viruses. There is always a kind of communication, some kind of group identity, and us against them in a way. Some kind of communication that exists, and then some kind of coevolution, and every kind of organism has that. So in that regard, that might be another argument to call viruses living agents, because they also have that. They make use of tools. They communicate. They have some kind of group living. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to know if you think that's so. This bleeds into another question. Do viruses have a sense of self versus other? There have been like quasi-species defined. Mm-hmm. So when an infection happens, it doesn't look like just one, single strain virus infects you, but there are many quasi-species that come along with it. Do you think there's coordination amongst the quasi-species? Like, if you look at a colony of ants, worker ants and other kinds of ants or bees, worker bees, the queen, the soldiers, the honey gatherers, that kind of stuff. Do you think that viruses could act in this way and they coordinate amongst close quasi-species to infect?
Yeah, I recently read a study that demonstrated that there was some kind of organized attack where the first viral particles are destroyed by the host. And it is a necessary step for the other viruses, for the remaining viral particles to then go forward. So some kind of layered attack, and then the first ones have to die for the next series of viral particles to be able to successfully infect the organism. So apparently there is some kind of organized attack sometimes that somehow gives this idea that there is a group. from a pure genetic point of view and also a sociobiological point of view, there have been a lot of studies in higher organisms. I don't like the term higher, but like in animals mostly and human beings, about inclusive fitness and why there is altruism, and then some people see that as a counting of genes. So it is more likely, for example, they say that I would jump into the water to rescue my niece than that I would do so to rescue some kind of foreign person, because I do not share that many genes with them. And so like that, communication, for example, is also something, and that seems to be universal. Communication is established between those that are more alike towards you in behavior, socioculturally, but also in genes. And so it might even be why there are different languages, because there are different cultural groups. And so that kind of communication is a way to establish a sense of group identity that is not shared with other groups. And so those become the ones that you fight against or that you ignore. And so this inclusive fitness apparently is also something that we can see already at a viral level. So that is a question. So a virus that mutates, is that a good thing for the virus or is that a bad thing for the virus? In a way, thinking about like how philosophers would identify agency, a mutated strain of me would not be beneficial to me because it would not be me. But on the other hand, if it's almost...
Well, even exactly you, I mean, epigenetically, you and the clone of you are going to drift over time. Or
Exactly.
if I was able to clone you and grow the other Natalie up like in 2 seconds to be your age, I mean, you would start diverging immediately more and more and more with different environments and stuff,
Exactly. But so suppose like, they that happens, but there is like still some kind of 90% similarity. Is that beneficial to me? Maybe for a virus it is. Like we know, for example, now the COVID-19 virus, it's not one strain. There are by now an enormous amount of strains. There are websites where you can find that. In Italy, the American ones, the ones that you find in Spain, there's a lot of variation there. And so this variation is that beneficial to the first one, to COVID-19 one? Is that beneficial for it to have these many variants or not? The person who invented the term quasi-species, who was Manfred Eigen, he used that to... So for a long time in biology, the idea was that you have the wild type, which was the dominant individual of a species. And so that one has to make as many copies as possible by himself because he is successful. But then what Manfred Eigen said was, well, what you see is that it's not like, identical copies of that individual that arise. What we see is that there are more and more mutations of that wild type. And so these are the quasi-species, because he says in order for a species to evolve, these quasi-species need to overthrow the existing wild type. And so it is the quasi-species, the group of mutations of the wild type that eventually take over.
Yeah, some people have even told me like the idea of a species or a strain in the bacterial world or the virus world is not even applicable. Like E. coli, there's so many different variants. How could you say what E. coli is,
Yeah.
The same thing with viruses. It's weird. There's no archetype. I mean, on some level there is, but not exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that regard also, like we biology, the way that we know it, and based on philosophy and people like Aristotle have long thought about these essences and the idea that there is this human microbiome, there is this human genome. Like when they did the genome studies, it was called the Human Genome Project. And what did the Human Genome Project show? That we were 70% genetically a melon. That we were 98% chimpanzee and bonobo. So, there is nothing unique and human about these genes that have been around for a very long time, and sometimes at 98% it gives a chimpanzee or a bonobo, and at 100% it gives a human being. So we had the Human Genome Project, and then people were saying, what makes a human is we're going to find that with the Human Genome Project, we're going to identify these genes. And then the Human Genome Project demonstrated that 70% of the human genes that are there are shared with melons, and 98% of those genes are shared with chimpanzees and with bonobos. So there is nothing particularly human about the human genes that they found. These genes have been shared and been around with many organisms out there. And so much of what you said about these viruses, that goes the same. Although that's also very interesting. Viruses apparently have an enormous amount of genes that are not found in any other individual, in any other living being, such as archaea, bacteria, or eukaryotic organisms. In fact, 80% of the genes that are found in viruses are unique to those viruses. So apparently viruses are somehow like gene-creating machines or gene-containing machines that, store this genetic material or make this genetic material.
So a couple more things. If I have a bacterial cell, let's say, and I suck out some of the components so that the bacterial cell really can't function properly, and then a virus goes and fuses to it and tries to enter, do you think the virus would sense something's wrong and stop mid-entry, or do you think it would just go ahead blindly and just enter the cell as normal and nobody's home, now I'm stuck?
That kind of language is difficult because it all depends on biochemical cues and signals. So it's like a lock on the door. So if the door is open, you might go in the virus, but if there is no hospitality or anything like that, then he will not be able to do something. Plasmids or something that are around that they could take up those genes, but that would be it.
Okay, well, no problem. So I guess last question for now is, it's a generic one, and we've been talking about it. Like, what overall role, when you step back and look at evolution, adaptation, speciation, etc., what role do you see viruses playing?
I think viruses are major players in evolution, insofar as they provide an opportunity also to organisms to evolve, because there is this coevolution. If you are as a species attacked by viruses, there is only there are only so many routes that you can go. Like either you die from it, or you somehow learn to get along and to coexist. And so we know that sometimes organisms are able to change the genes of the virus in order for the virus to become less harmful, or the virus is somehow more docile to the organism because it somehow finds like this space where it can integrate and become part of the genome. And so I think that viruses are major players in biodiversity, in a good and in a bad way. With the COVID-19 virus, again, we see there, like at this moment in time, we are talking about, I think, 19 million infected individuals, and we are almost at 1 million of organisms that died, of human beings that died. So there are species that have a much less head count. If you look at all these bioconservation programs, there are species that are with much lesser numbers. So a virus can facilitate or induce extinction, and it can also help with adaptation and perhaps speciation. Insofar as there becomes an interaction, there arises an interaction between the virus and the organism, so both of them evolve because of that interaction. So as such, a virus is a major player in evolution.
Oh, excellent. That's excellent, yeah. Well, very good, Nathalie. We're out of time. What's the best way for people to follow up on your research and to learn more from you? Where can they go?
So I have a website, which is the Applied Evolutionary Epistemology Lab, and the website is appeel, APPEEL, .fc.ul.pt. So I'm at the University of Lisbon, and you can find me there. And also, just if you Google my name, you can find my academia page where you have all my papers. And we have a YouTube channel as well, so they can find me there.
Well, very good. Nathalie, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to have been here.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.